Welcome to Spooky Pasta, the place where your nightmares come to life. Today's story, The Dog Man of Vegreville, by Head of Spectre. I was 6 years old when I saw The Dog Man of Vegreville, and I will never, ever forget it. It was on a cool Thursday night in May of 1995. Mom had told me to go to bed, but I wasn't tired yet. I'd snuck my Game Boy under the covers and was playing Mario with the volume off, thinking that I was oh so clever. Mom was probably already in bed and Dad was working late, so he wouldn't be in to check on me anytime soon. I knew I could play to my heart's content, and I intended to do just that. My fingers moved clumsily over the buttons as I sent Mario to his death over and over again. I wasn't very good at the game, but it didn't matter. I loved it anyway. I didn't look up from the screen until I heard the distant pop of what sounded like fireworks. I remember that I'd peeked out of the covers. There was no flash of light outside my window, and while it was a beautiful night, there wasn't really any occasion to let off fireworks. All the same, I could still hear those frantic pops, one after the other. Bang, bang, bang. I'd never heard a gun go off before. In movies and on TV, yes, but never in real life. I'd never thought it would sound so much like fireworks. I set my Game Boy down to go and look out the window, half hoping to catch a glimpse of the show I thought was out there. As I looked out into the darkness, though, I saw nothing. Those fireworks had been very close by. I knew that much, but I couldn't see anyone who could have set them off. My house was in a small suburb that backed onto the woods, and my window faced the next-door neighbor's yard. I could see the lights on in their house, but nothing else. No one was in the yard. I noticed that the door to the back porch was open. No, not open. Shattered. Something had forced its way, and although I didn't quite connect the dots at the time, then I heard a scream. The terrified cry of a frightened woman that was cut off abruptly. That too was close by, and I could tell exactly where that was coming from. It had come from the neighbor's house. I stared at the house, trying to understand just what was going on. There were no other sounds, no other screams, just a pregnant silence. Outside my bedroom, I could hear my mom moving around. She must have heard the same things I had, and I could hear as she raced downstairs to investigate the commotion for herself. She hadn't even made it to the front door when I saw something emerge from the back of the next-door neighbor's house. It loped through the broken porch door, a scrawny, hairy thing that looked like no animal I'd ever seen before. I could see its pointed ears twitching on its head, and its pointed wolfish snout. Its limbs seemed too long. It seemed to limp as if it was in pain, no doubt from the gunshot wounds it had suffered. Its head turned to look at me, and I saw two golden eyes shining in the darkness. They looked upwards and into my window where I stared back at it. Whatever that creature was, it looked at me. It saw me. For a moment, our eyes remained locked. Time felt as if it stood still. Even from a distance, I know I saw something in its stare or in its face, but at the time, I couldn't put my finger on it. It was the creature that broke eye contact. It shook its head and shuffled away. Without ceremony, it took off into the woods. The darkness amongst the trees quickly swallowed it whole, and I lost sight of it. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. What happened next is a blur. I don't have any other clear memories from that night, nor do I remember much about what followed. I'm sure my mom did what she could to shelter me from it. I still found out the details anyways, because that's what happens in small towns. People talk and kids listen. While I may not remember what happened after my mom discovered the corpses of Nicholas and Ashley Burr, it was the talk of the town at the time, and every now and then, some people still whisper about it. Vegreville, British Columbia is a small town with a population that barely tops 3,000 people. Gruesome murders aren't exactly common here, and so when one happens, you'd better believe that people are going to remember it. According to the rumors, some sort of animal broke into the Burr household that night. Most people claim it was a bear, but I've heard some people insist it was a puma. Either way, it woke up Nicholas Burr, and he took down his hunting rifle to kill it. He found it in his kitchen and shot it about 6 times before it attacked him, and it damn near ripped him in half. Ashley Burr was found upstairs. The creature had gone after her next and ripped her pretty little head clean off her shoulders and crushed it to a pulp. It was shortly afterwards that it ran off. Supposedly, the commotion from concerned neighbors investigating the gunshot and Ashley's final scream spooked it, and it retreated off into the woods. Nobody actually got a good look at it. Nobody but me. Over time, I've taken to calling the creature the Dog Man of Vegreville. Of course, nobody else in town ever actually believed I really saw what I saw. They all took my words as proof that it was a bear, and as I grew up, I learned that it was best not to talk about it. It's easy to forgive a child for claiming he saw something unnatural, but as one ages, that becomes a much less forgivable offense. I never once believed that I'd actually seen a bear that night, though. As I said before, I remember very clearly what I saw. I've seen it in my nightmares for 25 years now, and it sure as hell wasn't a bear. But like I said, I keep that to myself. I'm a grown man now, and I've got other concerns to worry about. I've got rent to pay, a job at the local auto shop to keep, and I've got my mom to take care of. A few months after the Burr incident, my dad's car broke down on the side of a highway while he was on his way home from work one night. He must have been trying to flag down a passing car for help, although the poor bastard whose attention he got didn't notice him until after he'd felt the bump of his body beneath his tires. Dad died instantly, and my mom was never quite the same afterwards. Grief leaves scars on a person that never fully heal, and I had to learn to step up as the man of the house pretty damn quickly after that. I don't believe I've mentioned the Dog Man of Vegreville to my mom in a long while. She's got enough on her plate without hearing about my little side project. As age creeps up on her, her health has begun to fail even more. I haven't felt comfortable leaving her by herself. Sickness has left her unable to work, so I handle the bills. She does some of the cooking, but that's really just about it. I'd hate to push her too hard, especially when she's in such a frail state. A few months back, she had her second stroke, and it's been a slow recovery process ever since. I do what I can for her, I really do, but no matter how much I want to, I can't fix her. I can't take away the things that are eating her away, and bringing up my research into a local cryptid that I tied to what I know to have been a traumatic incident to her wouldn't do her any favors. It's best left off the table with her, but just because I don't discuss it doesn't mean I haven't put the work in. As I've said, I know what I saw that night, and I've been aiming to prove it for some time now. Throughout the years, I researched other attacks in the area. Vegreville only had the one, but I found reports of similar incidents in the surrounding towns. There were a few of them in the late 80s and early 90s. The attacks all played out similarly enough. Some unknown animal, suspected to be a bear or puma, forced entry into a house and butchered the occupants. Tragic as it was, it got chalked up to a simple animal attack, and that was it. You don't often hear of animals forcing entry into houses. Sure, if you look online, you'll find funny videos of bears breaking open cabin doors and poking around looking for food. However, those cabins aren't occupied when it happens. I've seen my fair share of bears. They aren't keen on people and generally avoid them when at all possible. Vegreville is a pretty remote place, but it's still far too heavily populated for most bears to want to get too close. Sometimes you might hear about them rummaging through trash or poking around people's yards. I'm sure there have even been a few instances where curious bears broke into houses looking for food. Attacks are rare, however, and when they do happen, they generally involve cubs. People don't care about that, though. There's an image of the bear as this demon of the forest, a violent monster who loves nothing more than to rip into fresh meat. People assume that just because they have the ability to easily kill a person, then they are inclined to do so. Supposedly, 3 bears were killed in response to the attacks. One in '88, another in '92, and one in '96. The one that died in '96 was a large female grizzly who had attacked a pair of hikers in the next county over. Since the attacks seemed to stop after that, people figured that was the end of it, and I've got to admit, part of me wondered if that really was the case for the longest time. But then the attacks started up again. I saw them on local news stations. The same story as before. Forced entry into a house and the total slaughter of its occupants. I knew it was that same creature. I could feel it in my bones, and I knew this was my one shot at proving what I'd seen all those years ago. I had no intention of wasting it. The most recent attack occurred in a town called Weston, a few kilometers north of Vegreville. I'd heard about it in the paper, and the next day, I figured I might as well head up to investigate. At worst, I'd waste a day in another town. At best, maybe I might find myself one step closer to understanding just what it was I saw that night. What I knew going in was that Elsa and Janelle Harris were sisters. Janelle was blind and Elsa took care of her. One night, something had attacked Elsa while she was in her backyard. Janelle had heard the attack, along with the neighbors, and had gone to the door to call for her. Instead, she'd attracted the attention of whatever animal had killed her sister, and it had dragged her off into the woods. Police had found most of her body the next day. Most of it. The Harris house was in a quiet neighborhood just like my own. I could see the forest behind the houses, though. The map said that it wasn't a particularly large stretch of woods. It was little more than a ravine with a small creek that separated the houses from a nearby park. However, it connected with a larger area of the woods. It made for a perfect little place for man and nature to intersect. The house itself was still sectioned off with police tape. I didn't see anyone to stop me from going inside, but I didn't want to push my luck either. Why try it, right? I parked my car across the street and got out. Even if I wasn't going to go inside the house, maybe there were still clues to be found. The houses in that area didn't have fences. Weston was still fairly rural, all things considered. I could get into the backyard easily enough. The vast forest started at the end of the yard and stretched infinitely deep into it. As I walked past the trees, I was quickly swallowed up by the darkness of the canopy. Just what I was expecting to find, I really can't say. I kept my eyes on the dirt in front of me as I circled around to the backyard. Through the trees, I could see the yellow police tape, isolating the crime scene that was formerly the Harris's backyard. I didn't go too deep into the woods. It was better not to wander out too deep, or else I'd probably have trouble finding my way back. The area around me was oddly quiet. I could hear a few distant birds and some trickling water, but not much else. Slowly I approached the water, a small creek that ran over some smooth rocks. I didn't cross the creek. No need to go that far. But I stayed on the edge of it and looked out at the space around me. If the dog man really was the one responsible for this, it would no doubt be long gone. I suppose that was a good thing. I had no interest in meeting that thing face to face. As I stood by the creek, my eyes shifted downwards. I'd been half hoping to see something. A footprint, a bit of fur. Hell, maybe even some evidence that Janelle Harris had been dragged that way. I suppose that was my lucky day then. It was faint and easy to miss or mistake for something else. What I say was barely evidence, and yet I saw it all the same. The soil around the creek was wet and muddy. One small segment had grooves in it that indicated something had been dragged that way. A few stones were overturned and had been pulled out of the creek. I paused at the sight of them before I noticed what was right beside those drag marks. A paw print. There was only one. It had landed in the right place at the right time and sank deep into the drying mud. It wasn't even a complete paw print, just a few canine pads that looked only slightly larger than my hand, and yet looking at them gave me pause. I crouched down by the stream, wide-eyed as I studied the indentation in the mud. This was the closest thing I'd gotten to proof since that night 25 years ago, and I immediately took out my phone to grab a picture. "You lost, sir?" a voice said from behind me as soon as the shutter snapped and I looked back. A man stood a few feet away from me. He was older, somewhere in his 50s, and dressed in flannel.
"No,"
I said hastily as I stood up. "Sorry, I was just looking at some tracks." He studied me for a moment before nodding. "You with the police?" he asked. "Not exactly," I replied, "just doing some research. It's something of a hobby. What happened to the Harris girls? It's really tragic, but it reminds me a bit of some attacks that happened about 25 years back. I was just wondering if maybe there was a connection or something." "A connection?" the other man asked before scoffing. "That your car on the street, by the by? The red Corolla?" "Yeah, that's mine," I said. "You must be new in town then. You living in this area?" "Excuse me? I saw your car the other day. It was your car, right?" His brow furrowed. "I don't think so," I said. "I've never been out here before. I'm just here to look into the killings." The man raised an eyebrow. "That's all, huh? My mistake then." "You said you found tracks?" I nodded before stepping aside to show them to my new companion. He kept his distance from me as he drew nearer and looked down at the indents in the mud. He studied them for a moment before looking back at me. "Well, that's interesting. I don't suppose you heard what the police had to say on what happened here, did you? Bear attack, right?" I asked. He nodded. "They did indeed. You mentioned other attacks in this area 20, 30 years back, didn't you? I remember those. I suppose this does fit the bill. You ever hear of a man named Tyler Fox?" The name wasn't familiar. "No, sir," I replied. "Well, I was barely even your age when those attacks happened last, so my memory isn't great. If I recall, folks chalked that up to a bear as well. Fox had some other ideas, though. I remember he was working with the police, taking pictures of prints. If I remember, those prints looked a lot like this. If you snapped any pictures, it might be smart to bring them to him. Chances are he might know something." I looked down at the paw prints once more before looking back at the man. "Tyler Fox, you said?" I felt something brimming in my chest. Hope or elation, perhaps. If there was evidence from the attacks 25 years ago, maybe it would tell me more about what had been out there back then. Maybe it would tell me more about what was out there now. Where would I find him exactly? I asked, and I barely hid the excitement in my voice as I did. The neighbor gave me an address about 15 minutes away and a phone number to call. Tyler Fox picked up on the second ring, and when I told him I'd found some footprints, he seemed pretty eager to meet. His chosen meeting place was a small diner out on the edge of town. A little greasy spoon, the likes of which you'd probably find just about anywhere, and either served the worst food in the world or the best. No in between. Fox was a man who was right on the edge of 60, with frazzled gray hair and serious eyes behind big studious glasses. He was waiting for me when I arrived, and I could see his impatience in the way he anxiously drummed his fingers. "Mr. Fox?" I asked timidly. His gaze locked onto me so fast I was sure he was about to attack. "Yes, that would be me," he said hastily. "You're the one who called about the paw prints, right? Out behind the Harris house." "Yes, sir, I found them just this morning." "Well, sit down.
"Sí."
Let me buy you a drink. I assume you've got the pictures?" "Right here, sir." I offered him my phone, and he snatched it out of my hand to study the pictures on the screen. He was silent for a few moments, and a waitress happened by to ask us for our drink orders. Fox had a beer. I opted for soda. A man I spoke to, one of the Harris sisters' neighbors, mentioned you'd looked into the attacks a few years back. I said once the waitress was out of earshot. "You had some ideas as to what might be causing them?" I did, Fox said, his voice distant. He was barely listening to me. After a moment, he set my phone on the table and pushed it back towards me. The cops back then were quick to chalk the attacks up to a bear. Could be that they were right, although I always thought the tracks looked off. Well, those tracks in the picture. I'm no expert, but I don't think those were bear tracks. They could be. He said, the two main theories I've heard floated around are either bears or wolves were responsible for the attacks. Bears have 5 digits on their paws, just like the tracks you showed me, and the size looks just about right. However, if that is a bear, I'll be very surprised. Why is that? I asked. The palm of the tracks. They've got the right amount of digits, but the palm is too wide, like a man's palm. He raised one hand and curled his fingers inwards a little bit to make a claw, only much bigger. You say you found this out behind the Harris house, right? You swear it? Yeah, I swear it, I said. Fox huffed. I didn't know if he believed me or not. These look exactly like the tracks I found a few years back. Exactly. Off the top of my head, I'd say this was the same animal. As for what exactly that animal is, well, hell if I know. I take it you're looking into all this. If you were poking around the Harris house? I hesitated for a moment before nodding. That's right. Well, good luck to you. I dug through this shit all those years ago. I never figured out what was really behind those attacks. If you're digging into this, I can send you some of my old photographs and whatnot. I'm a little too old to be trudging about the woods these days, but it might be there's something in there that can help you. Please. I said, I could pick them up today if you're offering. Eager, huh? If you insist. Can't say I have much better to do, Fox said with a shrug. He took a long sip of his beer. I'll buy you lunch first, though. Hell, least I can do for the kid who's taking up the torch, right? I'd appreciate that, Mr. Fox. Yeah, you'd better. He chuckled humorlessly before taking another sip. What do you suppose it is? I asked. I know you said you didn't know for sure, but I don't know. What do you think is out there? Like I said, hell if I know. He repeated, if I had to guess. Subspecies of something. Bear, wolf. I don't know. The woods out here are thick and deep. I've heard people talk of Sasquatch, monsters, demons, and all sorts of strange things. I've never fully bought into all of it. I always figured there was a rational explanation, and that's honestly the best I can come up with. He shrugged. For all I know, it really is Bigfoot out there. Either way, it's killing those people, and clearly it's back. The waitress who'd brought us our drinks returned with a friendly smile and a charming greeting of, have you boys decided what you'd like to eat? Yeah, I'll go with the Salisbury steak, Fox said without even looking at the menu, and the waitress looked expectantly at me. I hadn't had a chance to go through the menu either, and with the way her eyes lit up with recognition, I didn't get a chance either. Oh, it's you, she said, half surprised and half relieved. She said it as if we'd met before, although I was sure I'd never seen that woman before in my life. You look a lot better today, don't you? Excuse me? I asked. Oh, don't you remember? You were pretty out of it. It was. Oh, what? A few days back? You were on the side of the road. We gave you a ride. I stared at her, unsure just what the hell she was saying, and yet her smile held a sincerity to it that was difficult to argue. You don't remember? She repeated. Sorry, ma'am. I'm afraid you have the wrong person, I said quietly. Fox was looking at me expectantly, one eyebrow raised, and I saw a dejected look cross the waitress's face. She was probably wondering if she'd either really got it wrong, or if I was trying to save face and she'd embarrassed me. Oh, well, maybe I do, she said quietly. I'm sorry. That must have been my mistake. Sorry about that. No worries. I assured her and forced an uncomfortable smile. I guess I've just got one of those faces. I guess you do, she repeated, trailing off slightly before taking a step back. She offered a sheepish smile and left without even taking my order. Another waitress conveniently came along to take it after I'd had a chance to look at the menu. Fox never asked me about what she'd said. I suppose he took it at face value and opted to stay out of it either way. I was grateful for that much. When I left Weston, I had an old box filled with old photographs of paw prints in mud. Fox had been generous in what he'd given me, and I couldn't get home to pore over it all fast enough. I'd stumbled upon the motherlode of Dogman evidence. Not enough to truly convince anyone, no. It would take a hell of a lot of proof to ever really be enough. But it was enough for me. I faked sick and took the next day off work just to pore over the photographs and files. Fox had just about everything, including detailed reports of every suspected encounter with whatever creature he thought was behind this. In a 100-kilometer radius of Vegreville, I counted about 12 different supposed attacks from 1990 to 1996, including the Burr family. There were photographs and even one or two plasters of footprints taken from the scene, but not much in regards to eyewitnesses. Nobody had clearly seen what had attacked those people, and the best information I could find was people describing it as an animal fleeing the scene. It was more information than I'd ever had access to, but nothing definitive. At least the pictures of the prints were enough for me to compare to the pictures I'd taken. Fox had been right when he'd said they'd been similar. However, looking at them side by side, I couldn't help but feel as if the one I'd found was smaller than the one Fox had photographed. I supposed it made some sense. After all, after so many years, it probably wasn't the exact same creature, right? This one could be a juvenile, maybe even the offspring of whatever had begun the attacks, which posed a question. What had triggered the attacks this time? Why had they stopped? What were they starting again? I saw no real answers. Nothing to explain why any of this was happening, and that question hung uncomfortably over me. It was only a few days later that I heard news of another attack. My digging into what Fox had given me hadn't led me to any shocking new revelations, however. I knew I couldn't turn down the chance to look into another attack. So recent, too. I remember waking up that morning and coming downstairs to see the news on the TV. Mom was watching it intently, dead silent as she did. I remember her eyes fixated me for a moment, studying me more intently than normal. I offered her a comforting smile as I went over to join her. "Did you eat yet?" I asked. "I can make some breakfast if you haven't." No, I'm fine," she rasped and looked back at the TV. She didn't comment on what she was watching, but she didn't need to. I could see the recognition in her eyes as the anchor recounted the same story I'd heard before. Something had entered the house of someone in Vegreville. It had left no survivors. Once I was sure that Mom would be okay on her own for a few hours, I headed out to the neighborhood where the attack had happened. I kept my distance, of course, and parked my car just down the street. I could see flashing police sirens and yellow tape blocking the area off. No way I was going to get close to it, and I wasn't quite interested in trying my luck. I could see a few neighbors speaking to the officers and dared to let myself creep closer. Maybe if I couldn't go in, I could at least ask a few questions. One of the cops looked up at me as I drew nearer. He'd been talking to one of the neighbors, a middle-aged man I'd seen around town from time to time. He stared at me as if I was a ghost. I just chalked it up to shock. "Morning, officer," I said calmly and casually as I could. "What happened here?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss that," the officer said, his tone stern. He looked me up and down, his brow furrowing. "I've been asked not to let people linger around the crime scene. Best you go home. Let us do our work." Of course. "Sorry," I said, faking a smile. I could see the neighbor he'd been talking to still staring at me, brow furrowed in what looked to be anger. The man looked at the officer, then back to me. Our eyes met for a moment before he spoke. "You. I saw you last night." The officer paused and looked over at the man. He drew closer to me. "I remember the car. I remember you. You're the one I saw heading into their backyard." "Excuse me?" I asked. "Going into these people's backyard? Was this guy crazy?" No, it was you." The man insisted. He looked at the officer now. "That's the guy I was talking about. That's the guy I saw going into the backyard." He'd started raising his voice, and the commotion had drawn another officer. I took a step back, and as the man kept shouting, time seemed to become a blur. "Okay, sir, were you present here last night?" I remember the officer asking. "No," I said. "I don't usually go down this street. I was home all last night. You could ask my mom." "I saw you, asshole. Don't you dare fucking lie." The neighbor spat. "I saw your shit-ass car on the street, and I saw you going into their backyard. I saw it, and I've got it on my porch camera." "It wasn't me," I cried. "I wasn't here last night." "I can prove it, asshole." The man was in my face then, eyes locked to mine and screaming. I remember the officer stepping between us, although his posture suggested he was trying to protect the man screaming at me rather than the other way around. In my peripheral vision, I saw two other officers watching me. They seemed too close for comfort. "Sir, would you mind coming down to the station?" he asked. His voice indicated that I didn't have much of a choice. "We just want to ask you a few questions." My mouth suddenly felt dry. I could feel my pulse racing, but I still forced myself to say yes. I'd been at home all night. There was no way it was me that man had seen last night, was there? At the station, I watched the footage of my own car parking on the street outside what I now knew to be the home of Leon and Taylor Baker, along with their two sons. I could see myself clearly on that footage, walking into their backyard. Not a man who looked like me. And I couldn't come up with a single reason why I'd been on that film to the stony-faced detective I'd been in the room with. All I could do was sputter incompetently as he sighed and placed me under arrest. As I was led to a holding cell, I felt like I was in a dream state, ready to wake up at any second. What was happening didn't feel like reality anymore. I felt like I was drifting through something strange and incomprehensible. As I laid down on the cot they provided me, listening to drunkards in the next tank over, my heart was still pounding. My blood was racing so loud I could feel it in my ears. I don't remember falling asleep. I'm not sure if I really did fall asleep. I woke up at home about an hour ago. I don't know how much time I've got. I've seen the news about the police station. Apparently, someone recently escaped one of the holding cells and left 8 officers dead in their wake. That someone wasn't named. And yet the way my mom looked at me when I came downstairs said enough. Her lips were sealed tight and silent tears streamed down her cheeks as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the TV. I looked over at her and watched as she continued to cry. "I'm sorry," was all she managed to say. "I thought you'd be different than your father. I thought that when he died, this would all be over. I know you didn't mean to do any of it. I know that. He didn't either. It's just that work could be so stressful for him, and when the stress came, it came out." I stared quietly at her, watching her bury her head in her hands. My whole body was trembling. "It?" I asked her. "The wolf in him. It's in you too. He never could control it. Oh God. God. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't think you'd believe it was you. I didn't know what to do. Her final words were cut off into empty sobs, and I quietly withdrew back up the stairs. I don't know if I fully understand what's been happening to me. I realize now that there are gaps in my memory. Things I did that I can't remember. Things I don't think I want to remember. I can hear the police sirens getting closer. I know I don't have much time. I'll try and go peacefully. But I don't know if whatever is in me, whatever was in control during those hours I can't remember, will go without a fight. I think I'm going to die soon. I don't know. I don't know much anymore, but there is one thing I'm sure of. I think I've found the Dog Man of Vegreville, and I think that it's me.